to the channel, To Whom Shall We Go? In this four-part series, we're going to look at the origins of the Bible. We're going to look at how the Bible was inspired, what that means. We're going to look at how the Bible was compiled, how it was preserved through history, and how it is still being preserved and protected to this day. Welcome to part 3 in this four-part series on the origins of the Bible. We're going to talk about the Hebrew Old Testament or Old Covenant, the Tanakh, and then we'll talk about the New Covenant or the New Testament. First, we'll go over the Hebrew Bible called the Tanakh. The majority of the texts were written in Biblical Hebrew, also known as Classic Hebrew, as we discussed earlier in part 2. However, some portions, such as those found in Daniel and Ezra, were written in Biblical Aramaic. Evidence suggests that the process of canonization occurred between 200 BC and 200 AD, as we also briefly touched on part 2. The predominant view is that the Torah was canonized in 400 BC, the prophets in 200 BC, and the writings in 100 AD. The original text that was written in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah. The Septuagint translation, as we discussed in the earlier parts, was created and completed in the years 285 to 270 BC. And that were 72 scholars at Alexandria, and they translated the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. The 24 books of the Masoretic text was written in Hebrew and Aramaic and considered divine and thus hold authoritative significance. During the Second Temple period, the Jewish people undertook the monumental task of sorting through the religious texts to determine the divine origin. So, sorting out the things that they found to be divine and those that were not. Some say that the act of the Masoretes was to kind of protect the Hebrew culture and religion a little bit apart from Christianity. Regardless, we're blessed to have this text. And additionally, the Hellenistic Greek-speaking Jews of Alexandria produced a Greek translation of these texts, and that just further cemented the importance. In other words, this is the canon of Scripture for the Old Covenant or the Tanakh. So who were these Masoretes? They were medieval scribes from Tiberias and Jerusalem, along with those from Babylonia, and they compiled a set of pronunciation and grammatical guides called the Nikud. They added these notes to the biblical text to establish the pronunciation, paragraph and verse divisions, and cantillation of the Hebrew Bible. So if you see the Hebrew and there's little dots under it and little marks around letters, it's a consonantal inscription, so there's no vowels in there. If you don't know the meaning of the letter and the context, this will tell you what vowel to put in where. So it's like I said, it's a text aid and a reading aid. So the oldest dated manuscript from this group was dated 895 AD. So the Hebrew texts of today were most likely produced from the Codex Leningradensis. It was the oldest manuscript of the Hebrew complete still in Hebrew language. It's presently stored in Leningrad Public Library. It was compiled using the Masoretic text. The New Covenant or the New Testament. The core books of the New Testament were completed before 120 AD, and that's one of those things that scholars debate. The Gospels were likely written slightly earlier, with Mark and others being the first one written around 70 AD. So, what kind of argues for the early date being just prior to and earlier than 70 AD are these interesting omissions from the scriptures of the New Testament. So in 64 AD, Caesar Nero's persecution of the Christians, they would just started destroying believers, basically. Why is that not in the scriptures? It's an interesting omission. James was executed, the leader of the early church, one of the apostles, and died in 62 AD, but that's not mentioned in any of the letters. The Jewish revolt against the Romans in 66 AD, and Rome kicks back and destroys the temple of Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is destroyed. Why are those things not in the scriptures? I think that's very notable, and I think that's something that scholars need to take very seriously. So, most likely, the New Testament was written within that lifetime of those who were with Jesus and prior to 70 AD. So, the role of scribes, and scribes were basically professional administrators. Their job was to copy manuscripts and other texts, as well as clerical and administrative duties. It includes dictation and keeping of business and judicial and historical records for kings, for nobles, temples, and cities. So they're pretty important, very detail oriented. Paul mentions a parchment notebook, the predecessor to the subsequent codex, which is the ultimate departure from scrolls into parchment. And in 2 Timothy 4:13, Paul is saying, "Hey, when you come this way, grab my coat and don't forget the parchment." Early New Testament manuscripts. When you hear somebody say, "Oh, there's some errors in the Bible," well, as we talked about in I think part one, any of these errors are due to the transmission. In other words, you have people writing 66,000 copies of something over some lifetime. There's going to be some little errors. Again, those errors do not impact any sort of theology um, that is noted. They're usually small calculations, a sentence missing or something, and there's usually a note to describe it in the manuscript itself. So the scribes were also so very detailed. If you look at this picture on the right of this manuscript, they would make little notes on the side here, like, "Hey, this probably means this, but my job was to copy it, so I just copied it." So as these are studied more and more, they can find these little notes and say, "Okay, now these percentages go down, and the importance of this error is diminished." So again, archaeological evidence and just good study habits and documentary evidence, really the skepticism of this being a serious, infallible, and inerrant book should be pretty much dismissed at this point. So that ends part three. In part four, we're going to discuss the English translations, and then I'll have some kind of closing thoughts for you. Thank you for watching. God bless you, and we will meet again in part four.